Hi, bonjour. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Vicky Koo. I'm Communications Manager at Climate Action Network Canada. And I'm honored to introduce this panel in solidarity for a decolonized world, and to be here alongside some amazing Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies who are working to decolonize climate policy. So you'll hear in turn from Sarah Beth Hansen at Indigenous Climate Action, Caroline Priette of Climate Action Network Réseau Action Climat Canada, and Larissa Baldwin-Roberts of Get Up and Common Thread. Unfortunately, Rosario Carmona from the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs was slated to speak about the Decolonizing Policy Project, but is sick and not able to join us today. So we encourage you to check out their work. The link to that is in the media advisory that was sent out, or you can just go to iwgia.org. After we hear from everyone, we'll open the floor to questions. We'd also like to thank the Center for Biological Diversity for graciously ceding their press slot so that we could have this conversation here today. And grateful to those of you who have shown up on such a hectic COP day. And as in rooms out there, negotiators haggle over very technical, certainly very important brackets and commas and words. And as we see the results of geopolitical tensions playing out, we're here to kind of both take a step back, looking at the systems that got us into this mess and how they need to change so that we can get out of it. And to speak about some changes that are, for some of our organizations, within our power to make and to continue advocating for when we go back home, whatever the outcome here. Colonialism, as many of our speakers have said often and eloquently, is at the root of the climate crisis, and Indigenous leaders have been at the forefront of protecting our planet for so many years and have borne the burden of doing that work and advocating for systems change. But we recognize that non-Indigenous allies must step up, help shoulder some of that burden, and raise our voices in support of the idea that real climate solutions require decolonization, Indigenous rights, and sovereignty. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah Beth Hansen of Indigenous Climate Action.
Thank you, Vicky. Bojo Anin, Sarah Indigenous Thunder Bay and Dunjaba. Hi, my name is Sarah Hansen. I come from Thunder Bay. My home community is Bitagon Nishnabeg. Although I am a member, I am not a representative of my community, and I just like that to be known. Today I'm going to be speaking on Indigenous Climate Action's Decolonizing Climate Policy Project. And from that, we know that settler-led climate policies are failing. Indigenous Climate Action discovered that in phase 1 of our Decolonizing Climate Policy Report released in 2021, which focuses specifically on climate policy in so-called Canada. In this report, re-examined the Canadian climate policies at the time and found that while there were many mentions of Indigenous peoples, these inclusions were not substantive and lacked meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples. Furthermore, the specific exclusion of key Indigenous rights, like the right to free, prior, and informed consent, were indicative of the treatment we've seen and experienced globally since the first report launched in 2021. 2021 was the first year I attended the UNFCCC's COPs with Indigenous Climate Action, then as a youth policy intern. In that first year, I realized the limitation of this space in understanding our rights as Indigenous peoples and how the system is set up to fail us. We are not stakeholders, but rights holders, and as scary as it is for states to hear, we are also the communities where 80% of the world's biodiversity is preserved through our decolonial approaches to climate actions, despite contributing the least to climate change. The unique rights of Indigenous peoples is a relatively new concept in the colonial context, with the recognition being very slow. Global endorsement of the rights as defined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, was only implemented in 2007. Even then, 4 countries rejected this declaration, those countries being Canada, the United States of America, New Zealand, and Australia. Eventually, they all signed on by 2011, but these rights are still to be implemented in our countries. UNDRIP is only a foundational international instrument for understanding the unique collective rights of Indigenous peoples and how states can meaningfully engage with our people. This outlines the bare minimum standards for respecting Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Let me repeat that, the bare minimum. In some UN spaces, UNDRIP has paved the way for valuing Indigenous participation, including the UNFCCC and at the national and regional levels at home. As colonial states rush to find global agreements on what processes and strategies are needed to combat the climate crisis, the voice, knowledge, rights, and strategies of Indigenous peoples are gaining traction. However, as we at Indigenous Climate Action continue to do this work supporting our Indigenous communities to even understand colonial climate policies and engage in these spaces, it is our non-Indigenous allies' responsibility to take our leadership and work with our communities to better understand our rights and work alongside us to uphold them. In Phase 2, Part 2 of our Decolonized and Climate Policy Report, releasing very soon, this is a specific request by Indigenous youth to increase the capacity of our allies to understand our rights without infringing on our autonomy. If you're curious about what can be done, through our research, we identified 6 pathways to support the fundamental shift to Indigenous-led climate solutions. They include centering Indigenous ways of knowing and being, aka decentering settler ways, asserting, defending, and respecting Indigenous self-determination, sovereignty, and consent, redistributing power, wealth, and land, decentralizing climate governance and building community power, building powerful intersectional international movements, and finally, ensuring accountability and reparations. Indigenous people already have the alternatives and solutions to address the climate crisis. We need the time and funding to be out onto the lands, together, listening to the lands and speaking our own languages. For these solutions to flourish and for balance to be restored, we need settlers to do their own work. In the report, Jennifer Menominee from Washanishick First Nation states, "We always knew how to take care of ourselves. We knew where the medicines lay. We knew how long to take care of the land. They always took care of us. Let us go back to what we were doing best." It is only through land back, full access to territories, and the restoration of our full jurisdiction over our lands and waters that we will be fully able to flourish as climate leaders, enact our own climate solutions, and nurture healthy ecosystems able to maintain resilience as the climate changes. But we cannot do this alone. Our Executive Director, Ariel Deranger, says, reclaiming policy would be about a decolonial process, which is to deconstruct the systems as they exist and rebuilding them with different metrics. While we know that Indigenous knowledge is necessary to address the climate crisis, we need settlers to approach this work with humility and a willingness to enter into a reciprocal relationship with Earth by acknowledging and fighting against the ongoing colonial efforts in so-called Canada to suppress and oppose Indigenous governance systems. We also must move beyond consultation to real decision-making power for Indigenous communities. I must be clear, the term Indigenous-led solutions doesn't excuse settlers and allies from the responsibility of implementing these recommendations. Settler cooperation and support in Indigenous-led climate work is critical. Settlers and their governments and other institutions need to, 1, stop making this work harder for us through your colonial policies, industries, and false solutions. 2, demand that your governments uphold Indigenous rights and title. 3, fight for land back. Land must be returned to the communities from whom it was stolen, so we have the spaces to enact these solutions. And 4, find active ways to actively support Indigenous-led land stewardship and climate action, including supporting our full sovereignty. So while we are doing this work in our own communities and territories, settler allies can do the work of transforming their own systems and fighting for climate policies that protect Indigenous rights, that support Indigenous climate governance on our own term, that reject false solutions and demand policies and solutions that transform colonial capitalism and hold polluters accountable. Our diverse ways of knowing and being are powerful climate solutions. For these solutions to flourish, we need our land back. Land back is climate policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Joe. Over to you, Caroline.
Thanks so much, for the invitation, and Sarah for getting us started. My name is Caroline. I'm the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada. Climate Action Network Canada is the country's largest network of organizations, over 160, working on issues of climate and energy. Our members are mostly settler organizations that are environmental groups, trade unions, social justice, development, health, youth, faith groups, and local grassroots initiatives. We also have Indigenous governments within our membership. And our work is motivated by our deep commitment to achieve climate justice, racial and social justice, and the certainty that this can only be achieved if everyone's human rights are upheld. There can be no climate justice without human rights, and Indigenous rights are distinct from those human rights and essential to climate justice. The settler climate movement is starting to confront a truth that our Indigenous allies have known and told us for many years, which is that the causes of the climate crisis are our colonial, capitalist, and extractivist systems, as Sarah was saying so eloquently earlier. And so as a settler-led organization working in a state built on colonialism, what is currently called Canada, we do need to recognize the importance of decolonization everywhere, and we try to do that at CanRAC, within the network, within the movement, within our organization, with humility, given the fact that our movement historically has been quite exclusive of those on the front lines of the climate crisis, those also on the front lines of climate leadership, which includes Indigenous peoples. And our movement has also at times, and continues unfortunately, to cause harm. And so concretely, what I wanted to talk about today is how we can contribute to those efforts, which, as Sarah was saying, we have a responsibility as settlers to use the power that is currently imbalanced in our favor because of those unfair, unjust systems to support our Indigenous colleagues and friends in decolonization effort. And so I'm going to talk about the ENGO Decolonization Toolkit, which was written by a group of intersectional climate justice activists, organizers, and researchers who believe that decolonizing climate action is the most effective and transformative approach to addressing the climate crisis. This project echoes what many Indigenous people and groups have been saying for a very long time about those root causes of the climate crisis, and really concretely gives some steps for organizations, specifically ENGOs, but I would invite other types of settler-led organizations to also take a look, as I think it applies very well to nonprofits generally, to really go through a checklist of not only the why we must do this work, and why it's not only morally the right thing to do, but it's the way for us to build power and build coalitions that can actually lead us to win, but also give us a really clear path forward. So in the toolkit, there's basically a checklist including items for self-education. It does include, I think, our journey as individuals, which, speaking from my perspective as a white settler in what is currently called Canada, living in unceded Ganyan-Gehaga territory, some resources to do our own internal work, which I think is really essential to that journey. Then a mapping and a tool to help do a bit of an organizational evaluation. Different organizations will be at different places. And then some really concrete actions, looking at redistributing three things: redistributing power, redistributing wealth, and redistributing land, which are all a fundamental part of climate justice. The toolkit is linked in the press release, and we're happy after this press conference to really guide folks towards it. I think we're on this journey at CanRac. We have used it, and I would say we really haven't checked every box, and so I think this is part of the process and the journey to bring that humility and recognize that we all have a lot of work to do as settler organizations, lots for us to learn, and I think on an end note, just want to focus on two things: the importance of relationships, truly the way for us to build movements and coalitions that are powerful enough to take on those systems and those very few individuals who have entrapped indigenous communities into dependency to those extractivist business models and systems, is for us to really value those relationships. And so again, it starts with humility and kind of doing these exercises both individually as organizations but also as movements. And then finally, a point on coalition. Again, if we recognize really those root causes that Sarah was telling us about, we're going to need a lot of people power. And that means building solidarity and coalition across movements within the climate movement, but also the movement for land back, movements against economic austerity, racial justice, the labor movement, and that's truly the only way we will win. And so I think doing those exercises and entering in relationship in a good way, and again, bringing that humility to our work is where we're trying to start. And I'm really open to hearing from others how they're approaching this. Again, it's not something that we come to with a fixed solution or mindset, but something that we have to do. So yeah, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. And finally, over to you, Larissa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Larissa Baldwin-Roberts, and I am a Witchable woman. I am an Aboriginal woman from Australia. I head up an organisation called Get Up, which is Australia's largest political organisation. We have over 1 million members, and I'm the first Aboriginal woman to lead a major political organisation in Australia. I also lead I started another organisation called the Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network, and right now we are creating an organisation called Common Threads, which has hundreds of traditional owners and coming together around campaigning for land and country and against inequality and for our rights. When people think about, I think, Australia in this space, they don't think about Indigenous peoples of Australia. I think they think about Sydney and Melbourne and the big cities and don't understand that 70% of this land mass is, in terms of where our communities live, non-Indigenous peoples live, is in the big city centres, but most of our Indigenous peoples live outside of that area. And so there is a significant amount of separation that exists within Australia around who Indigenous peoples are, where we live, where we work, where we play, where we practice our cultures. And so you may have seen that last year we had a referendum in Australia for asking for a very modest thing, which is a voice to Parliament. It went to a referendum, and overwhelmingly, so we asked for an advisory body to the government at a national level, and overwhelmingly in every state it was rejected. This is just to say that when it comes to making Indigenous policies, there is huge opposition, and I think for Australia's place in the world, they're seen as a really, Canada also is like this, and New Zealand, our neighbour, they're seen as good allies, but the reality is they don't treat their Indigenous peoples well. Part of the reason that this happens is because there's a lot of fear among non-Indigenous Australians that if you recognise rights of Indigenous people, we have no treaties, we're the only Commonwealth country without a treaty, and there is no legislation in Australia that enshrines for the majority of Indigenous people's free, prior and informed consent. So what that looks like is, right now, all mining happens on Aboriginal land, but 60% of mining in Australia happens in very close proximity to Aboriginal communities. These are communities that can, in some places, be 10 to 14 hours away from, so our communities are classified by remote as their place away from essential services like hospitals, like schools, the things that you need. So this has a huge impact on the power imbalance, and what we see in Australia, the most powerful lobby group that we have that exists in Australia is the Mining and Resources Council. And for a very long time, they have advocated against Indigenous rights. A lot of people think about, who know about Indigenous rights in Australia would understand that we have kind of a two-tiered system. We have land rights, which was recognised in the early 50s, and through the land rights movement of the 70s, trying to expand those rights in different places across the country, we've seen that estate grow. So right now, almost 50% of the Australian land mass comes under what we call the Aboriginal estate. So it is under either native title or land rights. Native title is not land rights. Just 15 years ago, we had a Conservative government come into power and basically white ant our legislation. One of the significant changes that they made to that legislation was that we could not, of our own accord anymore, basically be the proponents of any economic development. So we are land rich, but economically very poor. We lack the ability to develop our own socio-economic futures. And it's significant. Just today, if you've been listening to the media, something coming out of the US, Indian billionaire Gautam Adani has been indicted for bribery and fraud in the US, coming out of New York. And the reason to say that, like, what does it have to do with Aboriginal people? In 2017, there was a bill brought into the Australian Parliament, into the Senate, called the Adani Bill. And that bill changed the legislation on native title rights in Australia to change it from a consensus decision on how we make decisions on our land to a majority decision. It had the impact of greenlighting one of the largest coal mines in the world. So, you know, I know that this is happening in the US, but the reality is he has been bullying and threatening traditional owner groups right across the world for a very long time. And this is how these billionaires and these corporations continue to extract fossil fuels across the world as well. In terms of where we're going forward, like, Australia has come out very strong. Our ministers have been here. Our Prime Minister has been on the phone to the Minister from Turkey. Australia has a huge bid in, and they want to host COP31. They want to bring COP31 to the south. It hasn't been there in over a decade, and that's really important. We want to host the COP in the Pacific because our brothers and sisters in the Pacific region, the islands, are very vulnerable to climate change, and we know we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But if we move to that COP, and Australia does not fix the native title regime to allow Indigenous peoples to determine our economic futures, what will happen in the transition? The reality is coal and gas will leave. Like, there would just be a point where it is no longer viable to have coal and gas. It is so expensive right now to produce. But at the same time, there are industries like agriculture. Our communities are really reliant on mining is very close to them. 60% of mines in Australia happen in very close proximity to our communities, but also agriculture. If you just simply remove these without any investment in adaptation, our communities overwhelmingly become economic deserts. That means we are now reliant on government welfare programs. There is not going to be any investment. So it's really important, like that we see in so many places, that, you know, there is people talking about a loss and damage fund. Australia made a significant, well, it was a $50 million donation, contribution to the loss and damage fund, the other day. It's not what's required. There's trillions of dollars that have to go into that fund. At the moment, Australia is per year paying $16 billion in subsidies to mining corporations to allow them to open up coal mines, to open up gas fields. It is insanity. That money needs to come to our communities to transition them to the future, to help fund the work that is happening. 80% of this world's biodiversity is protected by Indigenous peoples, and that means everybody in this world is reliant on Indigenous people living on their land, stewarding their land, protecting carbon sinks, and protecting a safe climate future for everybody. So we want to see real climate policy, not just talk. You know, if you walk past the Australian Pavilion, you'll see incredible Indigenous art, but unless we came here and were supported by individuals that were outside of our government, there wouldn't be any Indigenous people here. So I think we want to move beyond the rhetoric and make sure that our governments are actually there in policy and doing what needs to be done. And just to say as well, we are hundreds of different nations. Climate policy at one national level, at a blanket, kind of rolled out across the country, doesn't work. We have been the recipient for over 2 decades of receiving Indigenous policy from Canada, because it seems like Canada knows what they're doing. That policy doesn't work when it gets to Australia. And so we want to see significant investment in adaptation, and that's why, as Indigenous peoples from Australia, we're participating in the COP, and we will continue to participate into Brazil as well.
Thank you so much, Larissa. Thank you all. We have time for a few questions. If there are any questions from the audience, please raise your hand. And if there are not, I have a question or two for the panelists, but I'll just give it another moment. Yeah, please. Were you raising your hand? Yeah, great. Microphone over there.
Thank you very much for your wise statements and suggestion for what is happening in your countries. But one thing that I really want to talk about is, you mentioned Adani. I'm from Kenya. My name is Joseph Silali, and we're having a problem with the same Adani. He's trying to invest massively in our country where we have court cases. And I don't know what we can do as a people, because we are not involved in those big contracts that are costing the Republic of Kenya and the people a lot of money, and they are contracts that we don't know even how they are signed, and there is nothing like public participation. So what can we do about that?
I just want to acknowledge that so many Indigenous communities across the world, the Global South, are in incredible fights against Adani. It is an ultimate David and Goliath fight. For me, I think that, we're never going to have the money to be able to take these big multinational corporations with this much power who sit this close to government. These are, Indian oligarchs. That's reality. I think what we need to move towards is actually banning these type of lobbyists and these companies from places like COP. Unless we move that influence and that money out of here, it's completely always going to be a distraction from what is happening in these spaces. And simply, if we're serious about thinking about COP30, and that being the COP that we talk about Indigenous rights, we want to host a COP31 in Australia and make it the People's COP. There is, less and less you're seeing participation in these spaces from civil society because of the places it's being held in, because it's illegal to protest in these places. And we need to go to other places to make sure that the Global South can be represented properly and speak freely about what is happening in their countries without the fear of retribution. So I think there is an argument here as well for a COP to come to a country like Australia and come to the come to the South, but also be in a space where more people from the Global South could make it more accessible. But also understanding that the same powers that we fight against, we're talking about, whether you're talking about Tamboran in the Northern Territory in Australia, there are Indigenous peoples fighting against pipelines and extractions and gas fields in the US. These are the same corporations that are doing this, and we need to connect the dots.
Thank you so much. Great.
All right, thank you very much for the insights. My name is Dari Akogun. I'm an environmental journalist from Nigeria, and also from a community that have witnessed the effect of big corporations' activities in the area of mining of resources in those areas. Now, do you think it would be appropriate to provide more opportunities for these communities, both Indigenous community, both in the Global South and the other parts of the world, to be a part of conferences like COP and other UN conferences, so that they also have their voices heard at international events like this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that we're having the last 30 seconds countdown, so perhaps we can continue this conversation outside, if that works for everyone. This concludes the press conference, but certainly not the end of our efforts and action together. Thank you so much for attending. Would encourage those of you who are able to stay for the next press conference starting at 4:30 from our colleagues at the Center for Earth, Energy and Democracy. Thank you and take care.